Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of two lectures for our inaugural year of the On the Brink Lecture Series and Book Award. We're very lucky to have Laura Harjo and Arturo Escobar here with us this evening to talk a little bit more about their books and be in conversation with us about them. I'd like to begin quickly by saying the UNM land acknowledgement before I pass the mic, as it were, over to the dean. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations and acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. Dean Gonzalez, if you'd like to give a welcome.
Yeah, Robert here, and welcome everyone. Thank you, Laura, for joining us. We're sorry that you can't be here in person with us, and we're hoping that moving forward we'll bring everyone together. I just want to thank everyone who participated in this process, especially jurors who devoted a lot of time working with Kathy in the selection process of these phenomenal volume. And this was a complete experiment and it worked. It was identify relevant texts that are breaking new ground, that are written in some ways in the spirit of J.B. Jackson, who wrote and was assembling thoughts around disciplines that had not yet been established and was a real trailblazer. And I would put the two books that we're going to talk about today in that category of trailblazing texts, introducing at new edges of disciplines with new terminology and bringing all of that to the center. And ideally, the goal was so that we are identifying important texts for our students to read and to identify with. So thank you so much for joining us. And I turn it back to Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So the schedule for the evening will be that each author will take about 20 minutes to discuss a part or sort of a general scope of their book. And then there'll be some time for each of them to discuss together a couple of themes that may resonate or any questions they want to ask each other. And especially during that time, I'll be gathering questions from all of you to help insert into that conversation. And I look forward to making it a broader talk with everyone, discussion with everyone. So tonight we're going to begin with Arturo Escobar, who's an activist researcher from Cali, Colombia. And he's working on territorial struggles against extractivism, post-developmentalist and post-capitalist transitions and ontological design. I will leave it there so he can begin talking in the interest of keeping time. So thank you so much for being here, Arturo. Welcome.
I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and my wireless cursor just stopped working. That's fine, I can use the finger thing, but so thanks so much, Catherine, for the invitation, for the presentation, Dean Gonzalez, Laura, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Thanks to the jurors for the prize, for the award. Thanks to the school, of course. And what I'd like to start by talking a bit about the title and subtitle of the book before I show some images for the rest of the presentation. And to start with the subtitle, and especially with this concept, the subtitle is Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds in plural. And Radical interdependence stands as what many people now are pointing at as a re-emergent concept, that it really points at the real foundation of life. That life is not about separation between humans and non-humans, humans and nature, between subject and object, between mind and body. It's not about this anthropocentric binaries and modernity, but that life really operates, as many people, particularly indigenous peoples and territorialized peoples have known all along, on the basis of this continuity between all these domains, on the basis of the acknowledgements of the facts that everything is mutually constituted, that for anything to exist, everything else also needs to exist. So there's radical interdependence. I will explain each of these terms in a moment. The second term is, I'm going to go to the last of the subtitle, the making of walls. And that refers to the fact that the worlds in which we exist, they are made, they are designed. And modern worlds have been designed from the perspective of this separation, the assumed separation between humans and non-humans, and so forth, between the secular and the sacred. And that has had particular consequences for the worlds that we inhabit today. So that's the ontological dimension of design. That design is really about the real. It's about life. It's about how do we think about life and how do we build worlds. Autonomy, why autonomy? Because we need to regain the autonomy over the making of life and the making of worlds. We in the modern worlds have given up, have entrusted that ability to make life to experts, to the state, to corporations, and so forth, and we need to reclaim that back. Finally, pluriverse. Pluriverse, if the world that has been made by modern design and modernity has been supposedly a world made of a single world, a world where only one world fits, the capitalistic, globalized, patriarchal, colonial world, then we have to go back to this idea that the world is really multiple. The world is made up of many different worlds. The Zapatista indigenous struggle from Chiapas have coined this concept that we need a world where many worlds fit, a world that is made of many worlds, not just of a single world, as in modern conceptions and ontologies and design. So now, oops, just a second, please. Let me try to. Oh, now that my cursor doesn't work, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to share the screen. Let me see. Okay, just a second. If I have it here, just bear with me for a second. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So this painting for me comes from indigenous peoples in Colombia for me. And we were talking with Laura right before the beginning of the session today about how for indigenous peoples, this ontology of interdependence is really the way life is and works. It describes well for me or represents this idea of interdependence and the pluriverse. So let me continue. Okay. So let me continue by providing what I think is the largest context with which the book deals, which is the concept of civilizational crisis or terricide, the crisis that is particularly indigenous peoples in Latin America started to emphasize since 1992 at least, that we are facing, that the crisis today is a crisis of a particular mode of existence, a particular civilizational model, heteropatriarchal, capitalistic, colonial, racist, and so forth. And that as such, then we need a transition, a civilizational transition to a different way of being, a different way of doing, a different way of thinking, to the pluriverse, to that world where many worlds actually can live and coexist in interdependence. and that there is the principle for transitions is moving from these dualistic binary conceptions, very much linked and entangled with capitalism and patriarchy and racism, to a taking again interdependence or relationality as a real foundation of life. So if there is a civilizational crisis, it means that design is in crisis. So we need to construe design today as a field, as a practice in transition, so that it can also be at the center of transition. And this is just a way to represent these dualisms of modernity. I mean, most of you know this very well, but especially this idea, very powerfully articulated by the Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter, who says that we are contained or even trapped within a mono-humanist view of the human that she describes as secular, liberal, bourgeois, and Western. So secular, liberal, bourgeois, and Western, this idea of the human, and she calls on us to move past that way of being human to a ecumenical horizon of the human, where many other ideas of the human can also be flourishing. So what's the difference between these two, and why talk about design as ontological? So design is ontological because when we design things, we design ways of being. And there is this double formula that we design the world and the world designs us back. So if we design from the perspective of this dualistic ontology, again linked to capitalism, high technology, and so forth, then we construct particular walls, and walls that are precisely the ones that are causing the civilizational crisis of climate, energy, poverty, inequality, and meaning that we are facing today. So we have to shift to a different way of designing, and this is the main proposition of the book, which is that we need to reorient design to take place in a non-anthropocentric manner from the perspective of radical relationality of interdependence. I like to spend a tiny bit of time on this concept of relationality or interdependence by using a couple of paintings. This comes from a young Colombian graphic designer and artist, Vanessa Roa, whose paintings all suggest that we are obviously not just human, we are also earth, we are mountain, we are river, we are interconnected, we're so radically interconnected with everything else that exists, that separation that we have been taught and designed into to accept is not really what life is about. So interdependence is this ability also of integrating the human with the rest of the flow of life, including integrating cities with the rest of the flow of life. And this is a theme that is coming now into architecture and planning, the field of how do we re-earth the cities? How do we go back to a way in which the city can be integrated with the rest of life and not design against nature and against each other? So again, I talked a little bit about this already. We designed the world designed us back. Same with the cities. We have designed the city, but we don't know how the city is creating us. It happens with all kinds of technologies. These are just some of the books that began to talk about design as ontological or ontological design. And just to give I like to give these very almost quintessential examples that we make a difference between a distinction between, which is very, this is very sketchy and very almost a stereotype, between the suburban home, the 1950s suburban home in the classic age, celebrated by Hollywood films, of the suburban home for the nuclear family, with an indigenous maloca, a long house, a collective house in the Amazon, where up to 40, 50 people can coexist in the same space. Although there are rules that apply, it's not that anything goes, there are rules that apply, and then we come up with very different worlds if we design, specially design through a space, our way of dwelling. If we start with the nuclear family design, we end up with a decommunalized, individualized model of social life or societies. And then with these kinds of urban developments and gated communities, that we have today. On the contrary, if we have a different design through a space in which is fostered to create more integration and interaction, we come up with societies that are much more communal oriented, and that we need today, as I will say at the end, to go back and re-communalize social life. The same with food. We start with an ontological separation between humans and nature. We end up with plantation agriculture, capitalist agriculture of this sort. We would end up with a very different kind of agriculture. We start with the agroecological, for instance, premise of interdependence. We can talk about digital technologies. This is one of the clearest examples today of how pervasively we are being so deeply designed by what we design. Fortunately, there is the beginning of a reaction against this very ubiquitous and pervasive kind of designing of hypermodern subjects through the digital technologies. Okay, so we need a shift in design. This is what the book is arguing towards designing relationally. And it's a trend in critical design studies. It's still a relatively small trend, but we find it already, for instance, in the work, very well-known work of Ezio Mancini. His latest book, Politics of the Everyday, comes very close to thinking and to actually arguing for a civilizational transition on the basis of non-anthropocentric design. This idea then that how do we relearn design from the perspective that the earth is alive, that we live in a living cosmos. We don't inhabit a passive, inert universe. And again, indigenous peoples have known this for a long time. Now it is time that we take those insights into the heart of design. This is my own mapping. This begins to be in the book, but is work after the book, that in these critical design studies, a transnational critical design studies field is emerging with different emphasis in the global north as in the global south, but there are increasing conversations between the global north and the global south around, for instance, what is decolonizing design or decolonial design, designs from the south, design justice, design transition design, which is an important field. And we can talk a little bit about that also in the question and answer period. So the key idea, designing is then emerging in these small critical design studies fields, including architecture and planning, as a domain for thinking about the creation of life and the making of worlds. It's not just about objects, it's not just about services, it's not just about institutions and buildings and so forth. It really is about life, which makes design profoundly and intensely political. And finally, in the last 5 minutes that I have, I'll just make, these are hinted at in the book, and to some extent they are there, especially in the chapter in the book, which is called on autonomous design, design by placing autonomy at the center of design, local autonomy by communities and movements, which is that we think about what principles of design, and then we'll have for each one of these axes of principles, we can think about criteria for relational designing. This is mostly what I see emerging from Latin American debates in both in activism and in social theory, social science in the academy, which is that we have these 6 emphases. First, the re-communalization of social life, because globalization has been an intense war against everything collective and everything communal. So we have to go back to regain some sort of balance between that hyper-individualized social life and a more communal-oriented, collective-oriented social life. We new understandings of communities. Second, the relocalization of many activities. Certainly food is one of the main activities that should be and is being relocalized in many different parts of the world through food sovereignty, agroecology, permaculture, urban gardens, all kinds of recovery of the commons and so forth. Third axis or principle is that designs for the pluriversal designing should also foster autonomy at the local level by communities, because without that autonomy, recommunalization and relocalization will be re-articulated or reabsorbed through new waves of delocalized globalization. The fourth axis, which is all Latin American feminisms and indigenous feminisms, Black feminisms in the US as well, emphasize the simultaneous depatriarchalization and decolonization, deracialization of societies. Number 5 is the reintegration with the earth, re-earthing everything we do, cities, we'll see in a moment. And number 6 is that we start fostering the convergence among these transformative alternatives that are beginning to regain the autonomy of making life for themselves. There's quite a bit of interest today in re-earthing cities, biophilic cities, biodesign, ecological design for cities. So this is something that I've been working on over the past 3 or 4 years in particular. We can talk a little bit about that if we can. Okay, and this is my last slide. So we're all designers. We have to take responsibility for the worlds we create anywhere, interrupt the global project of fitting all worlds into one, and think about transition and design as a practice for healing the web of life. Or designing, as we say as well in a different group to which I belong, as a practice of mobilizing for new ways of dwelling on the earth, which are new, but in some ways have always been around for a long time as well. Okay, let me stop the sharing if I can. Oh gosh. Just a second. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about the book. And thanks so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was really lovely. So as those thoughts are percolating in our heads, let me introduce Laura Harjo. She is a Muskoka scholar and associate professor teaching Indigenous planning, community development, and Indigenous feminisms at the University of Oklahoma. And her book, Spiral to the Stars, Muskoka Tools of Futurity, is what she'll be discussing.
Thank you. Let me just cue up my presentation. Can you tell me what you're able to see right now?
It looks like the first slide, it says Indigenous Futurity, Community Generated Practice of Futurity.
What about now? What do you see?
We see the notes.
Okay, let me fix that really quick. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I just want to thank UNM School of Architecture and Planning for me being here and for the jury that chose my book. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so Laura Harjo, Chaha Chifkidos, Yaha Helgi, Amatalwidos, Tuskegee, Amatalwidos, Yaha Elgi, Amalegidos, Dukarjo, Tate Moman Ellen Harjo, Churchkol Getawages. Hello, my name is Laura Harjo. My clan is Wolf. My tribal town is Tuskegee, and my parents are the late Duke Harjo and Ellen Harjo. So I'm going to be presenting today on Indigenous Futurity. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my book. I mean, I'm going to bring the principles of it, but I just want to show you like an example of it at work. Yeah, so I want to begin first with a land acknowledgement. So actually, the land that I'm on right now, that I'm sitting on right now, and I'm doing my own personal land back with buying this property and the house that's sitting on it. I'm doing my own land back. Where I'm at actually used to be the treaty lands for Muskogee Creek Nation. Then after the Civil War, that land was sort of like taken back. So long before the University of Oklahoma was established, the land on which the university now resides was the traditional home of Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes. This land was also once part of the Muskogee Creek and Seminole Nations, and it long served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler and colonial policies that were designed to assimilate Native people. And I add this in because it's important to say, okay, to acknowledge it is one thing, but it's kind of like, what are you actively doing? So I have a relational accountability to the indigenous peoples of the land, and I will actively work to recenter indigenous community and teach this as an act of dismantling settler colonialism. I want to begin first with this idea of indigenous futurity. So in my scholarship, the way that I lay this out is that it's a past, a present, and a future all happening at one time. So it's the unactivated possibilities of our ancestors. And what's really kind of not troubling, but like to kind of see this really come to fruition for everybody else too, not just indigenous people in the moment of the pandemic. So when I talked about this previously, I was thinking about like the ways in which US federal Indian policy has resulted in the premature deaths of many different generations of my ancestors. And I've had to think about like how they didn't live a full life, that they had unactivated possibilities that they weren't able to carry out. And now that we're in this pandemic moment, many of us right here in the Zoom room now have our relatives who have passed or friends, and they're now ancestors. They had unactivated possibilities. And like, what were the unactivated possibilities that they didn't get to carry out fully? And to what degree do you want to see your relative, your kin, their work being carried out? So it's also living out the future we wish for in a contemporary moment. So that idea of not asking permission for this, I would say very much so here in Oklahoma, that in some ways, like many indigenous folks are underemployed. So you can go and get college educated, but if you go to like a population center like Tulsa, you may not be able to find a job in what you do. You may be underemployed. So there are these structures and institutions, but what can we create in our own communities in a contemporary moment that looks like the kind of future we wish for, but we create it right now, despite different institutions that might subjugate us. And then finally, the creation of conditions for our relatives that will live in a future temporality. So kind of one of the examples behind this is I was working in an indigenous community and we were talking about sense of place, and the conversation was around, where do you see your community in 100 years? And what they said is that we won't have anything, we won't have any land, any language, and there'll be rich white folks living in big houses on our land. And so it's kind of like, well, what do you need to do right now to disrupt this imagined future? So then indigenous futurity is also putting in place the conditions right now so that our future relatives will have the things that we wish for them, whether it's language or heirloom seeds, or the spaces and places, the actual land to carry this out. And from my book, I have these 4 primary concepts that constitute Muskogee futurity. And I just want to talk about them a little bit. So Stajati, or radical sovereignty, is kind of the first concept, and that the idea of Stajati sovereignty. So Stajati in the Muskogee language, it means like a native person. That's how you say like Native American or indigenous. And so when I was growing up, and I grew up adjacent to Tulsa, and so for us, I guess Tulsa kind of operated as our border town. And so when we would go to Tulsa and we would see other indigenous folks, we may see somebody and like our little family would get excited. And like if it was a Muskogee person, they knew what Stajati meant. So you'd say, hey, Stajati. Or if it, you know, we have 39 tribes in Oklahoma, and there are 3 tribes whose tribal reservations kind of overlap into Tulsa, and that's Creek, Osage, and Cherokee, or Muskogee, Osage, and Cherokee. So those 3 tribes, you may see other tribes too, but when you would see somebody that you knew wasn't Creek, you'd like kind of lean in and whisper to your family and say, Stajati, and kind of like, hey, it's kind of like this acknowledgement of one another, and it's relationality. So then this idea of sovereignty, it's not kind of bound up in normative structures, especially normative governance structures that are kind of upheld often by capitalist practices and practices of racial capitalism. But it's a kind of sovereignty that is bound up, again, in this idea of relationality. And so kind of the kind of umbrella idea around that is this Muskogee word called anogechka. So anogechka means love, but I don't mean it like in kind of a relationship, a love relationship, like a heterosexual love relationship, or or homosexual love relationship. What I mean is love in terms of caring for one's community, the idea of caretaking. So as part of that anogechka, it is the kinship relations between human kin and your more than human kin. So when we say land is one part of all of your more than human kin aggregated into a word. So you may have land, sky, stars, constellations, water. All of those are more than human kin, but all of the entities that dwell on, above, under, within those locations that can't be located in Cartesian cartographies, those are also more than human kin. So our more than human kin, it can be flora, it can be fauna, it could be the spiritual realm, being in good relations with the spiritual realm. So we've seen this actually in mapping where indigenous peoples have done map biographies of their communities and denoted places where you might have to ask permission from a forest spirit to be able to pass through that. So that's not necessarily going to surface when you're doing design and planning. And that may be like something that that's dialogue that has to happen at the very local scale. So again, this idea of relationality with human and more than human kin. Another aspect of Stajati sovereignty is that you have to have those kinship relationships in order to carry out and caretake on your community in a self-determined manner. If there is no kinship or relationality, then like what do you really have, right? Then do you have societies where it's exploitative, it's predatory, what does it look like then to have this love and caretaking? Another core tenet kind of Muskogee ways of being in the world is this idea of energy, and that all entities are exchanges of energy. So that's Sajati sovereignty. So it's very like kind of locally focused. Community knowledge kind of scales out, and it can be like the things we smell. What is a smellscape? How do we sense a smellscape? Whether it's, you can smell firewood cooking that's at the ceremonial grounds, or you smell trash burning every morning because they're building native housing next to dumps. Like all of that is kind of knowledge as well. Then there's felt knowledge or embodied knowledge. So, and then I go on to collective power. How do people come together to create these places? And when I talk about power, I'm not talking about authoritative power or oppositional power, but people coming together in horizontal relations type of power. Then finally, emergence geographies. Where are the places in which sometimes you can't locate these through Cartesian cartographies? So I'm talking about concrete geographies, or those can actually be located. Ephemeral, maybe they come and they go. It's an indigenous skate crew that convenes, or an indigenous mosh pit at a show on a Friday night that convenes for a night and then disassembles. The metaphysical, so again, that's like the spiritual realm, or it can be knowledge with stars. And then virtual, so we see a lot of native games and that sort of thing happening through the virtual world. So that's kind of like, those are like the key principles of Muskogee futurity. So then indigenous futurity activates those. And so we have Sajati sovereignty, all these elements of community caretaking, recentering your kinship network across time and space. So I'll mention that a little bit later. Building kinship and relationality, producing and sharing knowledge. So I'm looking at missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That's kind of like the case study. In an Urban Indian Health Institute report, 94% of the respondents reported that they had been raped or coerced in their lifetime. There's an over-criminalization of Indigenous women and Indigenous men and children. There's been residential school and boarding school violence and carceral approaches to carceral problems. So then if you take these concepts of kinship and community knowledge production, then you have things like this. So this is something that my artivism class made, and they did screen prints of these. They cut these out and did their own screen printing. So you see our future, not theirs. And so this is really a nod at like futurity and extractivism, and that it serves settler futurity. This is another one of students sitting together, beating and dialoguing. And so this is also artivism, but this is also, there are a lot of beating circles that happen actually across North America. And really it's a way of, again, community building and community caretaking. And so this is also happening with both survivors of MMIW, like the families of folks, or actually folks that maybe were trafficked and they got away, or they have a family member that is missing or murdered. So there are several like online convening circles around this where people come together to dialogue. And with this piece of beating, then you kind of see like these circles of affect and power. So it's both community knowledge, it's kinship making and caretaking in terms of Sajati sovereignty, it's knowledge production, and it's a virtual space if it's happening on Zoom. This is an example of, it's called Bear Patrol. This is in Manitoba. So Manitoba, Canada, Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada, it's been called one of the racist city in Canada, and they have a lot of MMIW cases. And so they've taken power into their own hands. And you see this group of young men, they've created something called Bear Clan Patrol. So it's basically to patrol the streets and make sure that, you know, that Indigenous women and girls are passing through safely. Like, they can't cover everything, but, you know, it's this idea of not waiting on anyone and creating the future that you want to see right now. This is another one. It's a rideshare in Winnipeg. One of the co-directors here is Christine Brozes. So they organized this in response to ground transportation and folks getting disappeared through using ground transportation with local taxis and stuff, and folks not feeling safe. So in this case, the local Indigenous community organized their own rideshare program. So again, it's this idea of both collective power and creating the kind of future that you want to see right now. This is another example. This is the girls' wellness class at NACA, which is in Albuquerque. It's Native American Community Academy. So these are examples of how to make medicine. So you see here where they kind of grind up different medicine plants and they make tea bags out of it here. This is where they wrote letters. We worked with our Indigenous Feminist Planning Praxis class, worked with that local class when a girl's hair got cut at Rio Rancho High School, a Native American girl. It's been probably about 3 years now. She got her hair cut by the English teacher. Another one got called a racial epithet. And then another young woman was being harassed in the local school as well because she was Native American. So they were having to take this to the school board, and at the school board meeting, they were trying to only give them 2 minutes to speak. And so that was problematic, but we already knew that you couldn't find that much justice in the local governance structures. But these young women carried out a form of community caretaking by providing them with medicine teas and letters. And what emerged out of that was a Hair is Sacred party with these young girls that wrote letters and made medicine. And so this is where like community knowledge, embodied knowledge surfaced. So this is Hazel, one of my students. She said, well, we set up stations based on what people knew how to do. And we had a Hair is Sacred party with these young girls. So this is her doing a fishtail braid. And then somebody else said, I have a bunch of glitter at home. So they glittered up their hair. They honored their hair and recognized that their hair is sacred. And then this one was flower crowns and making paper flower crowns. And the girls were learning how to do that. Again, honoring their hair and remembering, like, despite how the local institution views them, they're sacred, their hair is sacred, their body is sacred, and reminding them of that. So I'll end here with this quote. This is actually a picture taken from their wall in their classroom. And it's, we have everything we need within us and around us to heal. Where do you get your medicine? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really provocative. So I don't know if the two of you would like to ask each other something. Oh yes, thank you, Katya. We should clap for both of these extraordinary people. Thank you. Did you want to begin maybe talking about the commonalities between some of these things? I feel like I was making like arrows from Arturo's notes to Laura's notes and back and forth. And I really found this last piece that you were talking about, Laura, really interesting, this self-determination, making the world you want to see right now extant to make it what it is. Really also connect directly to that idea of autonomy that Arturo was talking about. Would either of you like to kind of take it from there?
Well, since Laura just finished, let me begin with a comment and your question, Kathleen, and a couple of questions for Laura. And thanks so much, Laura, for the wonderful presentation and for your work. And yes, there are so many. I was writing notes as well about all the resonances and convergences between what you are doing from an indigenous perspective and what we've been doing in Latin America, mostly from indigenous, Afro-descendant, peasant, environmentalist, feminist perspectives as well. So from the perspective of people who belong and live on territories. And for instance, the one that obviously Kathleen mentioned is a very important one, the emphasis on sovereignty, which in the Latin American activist and social theory language, we call autonomía or autonomy. And there would be a conversation to have about that, but I want to leave it at that for now. But I also, the emphasis on place and the emphasis on community, on the collective power, on emergent geographies, which in the language that we use in Latin America, we call territoriality or territories as an always emergent entity as well, in which both humans and non-humans all together create a territory. So there's a lot of consistency between the two works. And I want to ask you a couple of questions, actually 3 questions to begin with. First, I was really taken by this idea, what you call the first feature of indigenous or Muskogee futurity, which is the unactivated possibilities of our ancestors. And in this work on design that we've been doing, we talked about the political activation of relationality, or the political activation of those ontologies, practices, communities that have maintained a relational outlook on life. And it's been always there, but they need to be politically activated. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that in connection to how to activate those possibilities and what does it mean politically. And I guess it means sovereignty and so forth, but maybe a little bit more about that. And second, this is something that is always asked of me in particular, I'm clearly, even if my parents came from peasant families, both my parents, in the first half of the 20th century, I already grew up in a city. So I define myself as a decommunalized individual in the process of searching for new ways of recommunalizing with others and with the earth. So a question that is usually asked of me when we talked about, you mentioned this very powerful concept, which is relational accountability. And obviously that's something that doesn't apply only to indigenous peoples, it applies to everybody. All of us, humans on the earth, need to be relationally accountable to the earth. And I like to connect that with the idea of the unactivated possibility of our ancestors. So a question that is usually asked when I talk about these things is, well, what do? We don't have ancestors. We in the West, we in the cities, we middle-class people, we white people, we don't have ancestors. So what do? We are doomed to be decommunalized. We are doomed to be individuals. This is for you, it's okay, but it's not for us. So do you have a usual response to that kind of question? And the last one is the idea of designing with 7 generations in mind, which comes from North American indigenous worldviews. Do you think this is a concept that we could fruitfully all think about in designing? And of course, is the possibility of creating the conditions for our relatives in the future, but also for everybody. How do we design with 7 generations in mind? And you also emphasize a lot the spiritual. Does that mean that we need to re-sacralize design in some ways, which in such intensely secular societies as modern societies are, how would we go about doing that? So I know there's a lot there, many complicated questions, but your thoughts would be greatly appreciated, Laura.
Thank you so much. Wow, wow. I really appreciate those questions. And I appreciate sitting here with you and sharing this talk space. Yeah, because I actually used to teach one of your works in my class, Indigenous Space, Place, and Mapping. So it's nice to sit here and think with you. So yeah, the idea of enacting politically Muskogee futurity. So one of the things I would start with is like under federal Indian policy, the ways that indigenous governments, many indigenous governments are structured really had to do with this Indian Reorganization Act. There were 2 of them, and they were like around the 1930s. And so it was almost like these cookie cutter governments. And I actually talk about it in my book at the beginning. And I talk about how when I was growing up, my parents were really active in the community. I didn't know it was called community organizing until I went off to college and learned that that's what it was called. But they would gather at the laundromat and sort out like what kind of future they wanted for our community. They rented space at a little strip mall, you know, an evening a month to talk. And then now we have our own community center. It's brick and mortar. And they have to use Robert's Rules of Order, and less people show up now. So it's like the more kind of, the more formal it became, the less interest people had in doing that. It's like, if I have to do accounting and do books, and I also have to work all day, and then I have to come here and I have to run this political normative governance entity that doesn't kind of abide by our community's value systems, then like it doesn't even bring me joy, right? So then it's like, how do you begin to reactivate the governance systems that did bring us joy? And the way that I see those governance systems being carried out are, one, through our ceremonial grounds. So we have our own time that is called the New Year. We have dances, we're giving thanks. It's a time of like letting grudges go and that sort of thing. But it's like, we already have a governance system set in place of how to carry out community caretaking, both at our ceremonial grounds. And then now we have like Christian churches that have been around for hundreds of years now, and they sing in Muskogee, they give like dual sermons in Muskogee. The design of the grounds are very much like our tribal towns before removal, because that's like our sociocultural use of space. So I would say that like from a governance side, like the way that we relate to each other has shaped how we have like designed those spaces, right? And I would say like relationality and places to be in good relations with each other, whether that's, like I say that softball is sovereignty. So whether it's at a softball field or in a native church that has an arbor outside, like we used to have back in the day, that are like the arbors at our ceremonial grounds, those are all political and governance systems of the community. And when I say softball is sovereignty, people are having those conversations about the future that they want to see, or how the tribal council isn't up to snuff. They're having those conversations not at a tribal council meeting or with the tribal counselor. They're having them in a lawn chair at a softball tournament. And like, I think that like, that's where governance is happening, like at like these places that people want to be, at basketball tournaments, at softball tournaments, at dances, and that sort of thing. And yeah, I think that that's kind of overlooked as a site of governance. And the same thing happens whether you're like, I don't know. I know that like people say detribalize, but like I sort of eschew that, because whether you're in Los Angeles or Chicago, you're still Muskogee and you're instantiating a geography of Muskogee Nation. So in my book, I talk about Aragon Starr's work. So, and it's about this traditional type of story. And in my book, I kind of talk about traditional doesn't have to mean rigid. So like, that's kind of like in thinking alongside your work too, of like rigid tradition, like kind of like turning away from that too. So she talks about Creek Nation in outer space and how, yeah, it's like just a traditional story, and the not so bright pair of this crew of junkers that are kind of like taking part in informal economy and foraging and collecting junk. They're told, okay, if you come across anything, don't eat it. And then this guy sees a can of Spam and he remembers his grandma telling him that Spam is really good. And so he eats the Spam and he turns into this traditional kind of really kind of robotic type of water snake monster that we have in our traditional stories. So I like how she kind of disrupts these containers that we always get placed in, that you can only be Muskogee if you're living in this 11 county jurisdiction in Oklahoma. And that's, for me, that's where like the emergence geographies come into, that there are these different sites where we perform our Muskogee-ness and instantiate Muskogee communities. And I think that that's a political act too, because we're resisting like elimination of the native and settler erasure. So yeah, I guess that's the answer to the first question. But I would love to hear any thoughts that you have too on that same question of like maybe how, like if people feel that they're decommunalized, because we've had students from Latin America in our planning program who felt like they didn't have any right to indigenous knowledge, or they felt kind of like apprehensive because they saw themselves as mestizo because they were 1 or 2 or 3 generations from being in community. And so, yeah, I was just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that too.
Okay, yes, quick response, Laura. And that's so interesting what you say, that Muskogee-ness can be enacted even in outer space eventually, where we go, wherever indigenous people go, wherever, we always carry a world with us. Everybody, whether we're modern or indigenous or from any ethnicity or any part of the world, we are people who have been worlded, performed into worlds. Even if we in the West as individuals, we believe that we don't have a world, we're just us, we're individuals. That's why even mestizo people in Latin America feel that they have been profoundly decommunalized. And that has been, as you will say, a product. There's a concept that we use as well, which is the active production of non-relationality. That the lack of relation, the lack of connection is actively produced by, again, sort of modern institutions, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and so forth. And so we have to go against the grain of that. We have to go against the toxic loops of existence that with which we coexist in modernity, that toxic loops of the individual in markets, making decisions to maximize our own gain, our own utility, innovating on our own, etc., etc. So we have to disabuse ourselves of those notions. I mean, there is no individuals. We know this from many religions, even Buddhism is about that. It's about the non-existence of that self that we imagine so intensely and effectively in the West. So my usual answer to that question is that we all have to co-create our ways, our communities. If we feel that we don't have any tradition that we belong to, we have to co-create it with those who are around us, in place, reconnecting with place. And everybody has to do that. We are all place-based peoples, even in New York City. So somehow make of urban neighborhoods a place to co-create more communalized ways of existence. So that's one answer to that question, Laura.
Yeah, and then like your other questions where you were talking about relational accountability and you said unactivated possibilities of ancestors. And what does that mean when people say we're white people, we're doomed to be individuals? What are we supposed to do? We don't have what you have. And then you also talk about 7 generations and how do you fruitfully think about that and design with 7 generations. So, I mean, I think that if you start with 7 and thinking about like this future, and sometimes, I don't know, I kind of play around with like the time frames. So sometimes I'll say 100 because that's like easier for people to grapple with in their head. But 7 generations, it's about 150, but it forces a relational accountability that you don't have to be like from a traditional indigenous community or whatever, but that you can still have relatives or kin that you care about, that you want them to inherit a world that you want to see them live in, whether that's your children or your grandchildren, or if you don't have children, you have maybe, I mean, in indigenous communities, right, we adopt people, like that's my auntie or that's my niece, but it's not like blood relations, right? But they're still kin. So how can we begin to see people more as kin than fellow citizens? Because like a citizen has a further distance in relationality than if you start viewing people as kin. So I think by starting maybe with like in one's own family or like their own kinship network in the city, how do you start thinking about that? And, I can remember having some conversations around that with, is Renya still in here? Actually with Renya Ehrenfoyt, that had come up in the past with other like colleagues. And how do you age in place, right? Like if you're a university professor and maybe you're living in a city and your blood relatives are not close, how do you have kinship relations with your colleagues and your community in ways that you can age gracefully in place, right? So even if we're thinking, you can think about it like in 100 years, what does that look like? You can also think about it like, I know for my own community, like we had people that put things in place several years ago. And my dad was one of them. He used to be a tribal council member. We had another neighbor who was on tribal council too, but they wanted to see like a place where our elders could come and eat every day. So we have that now. That's part of what we have in that building, but people just don't want to have the part of like running the stuff, right? So anyway, it's like, how do you think generationally? So like Hahola's work, and when I think about him and the late Delia Alcantara and her thinking cohort-wise, how do you think about different cohorts in the community? So if you have 7 different generations of cohorts, babies, young adults, adults caring for elders, like how do you start to like design for those different generations, those different generational cohorts in the community? And also, how do you start to put generations talking to each other too? Because not just indigenous communities, it's every community where like youth and elders aren't talking to each other. So one of the things that I try to do in my work is, well, in my teaching, is to create opportunities where you're going to have maybe some of our students or young, well, I mean, for the most part, students are younger, but they can be any age. But like having our students talk to maybe their elders in their own family, so that they're like creating an archive for the future of this relative, especially like in marginalized communities. People aren't necessarily going and like trying to create the conditions where that knowledge will surface. And we don't necessarily write stuff down. Everybody's not in academia. It's like that path gets very narrow when you start getting into academia on who's on it for like indigenous folks. So I think that's the other thing too, is even like maybe through either K through 12, high school, college, creating those kind of opportunities where you're teaching young people at an early age to start making those relational connections too. So, but I can see how just starting from family and broadening that. So when I think of like queer indigenous theory and making relatives, and maybe they're not your blood relatives, and a responsibility to them, and how the reciprocity of like, you know, you had my back and you took care of me, and, you know, I reciprocated, and how do you create those conditions where that continues to happen? I mean, like I could go on and on, especially when I think of like Two-Spirit and trans folks and violence against them, and how they often have to go into an informal economy because, you know, they're iced out of like having employment. So maybe they're the ones that are having to engage in sex work or other work that's looked at as taboo, but that's what they have to do in order to make a living because they're not accepted at work. But like, how do you begin to create also like safe spaces and economies and a futurity for them, you know? So anyway, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. We've actually gone over time a little bit, and I know that the evening's getting late, especially for anyone on the East Coast. And I guess I just want to say that this idea of making community and making place is just, I'm really thinking about things a little bit differently now after this past time together. I really appreciate all of your writings and your time today, your time last semester. This has been just an incredible evening. We thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your incredible work. It's much appreciated.
Thanks a lot, Kathleen,
Kathy.
Laura, Robert, everybody.
I'm sorry to the audience, we didn't have more time, but I'm sure if you wanted to email the authors, they might find some time in their super busy schedules. But I'm so grateful that both of you could be here this evening. Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye, Laura. Ciao.
Take care,
Bye,
everyone.
Arturo.
Good night.
Good night.